welcome to the Theology Pugcast, and we're glad to have you back. At least, I think that's appropriate to say for many of you. Maybe this is the first time for some of our listeners, so having people back is presumptuous. But anyway, welcome. Welcome to the show, and it's great to have you with us. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I've been a professor of philosophy. I've been a real estate investor, and I've done some other things. And I'm a member of the crew that constitutes the Pugcast. But I have a crew, and the crew is here. We're all together. So, Tom, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Tom Price, a systematic theologian and Christian ethicist. I teach both of those at several places, one of which is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary.
All right. And now, Glenn.
And I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a professor of history at Central Connecticut State University and a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Okay. Well, that's who we are. And each week, one of us is responsible for the topic of the day, and it's my day. My turn. And I've decided to focus in on the subject of human scale. Human scale. Now, the term human scale often is applied to architecture. And what's implied, or what's being referred to when people talk about architecture and human scale, is the fact that when buildings are well designed, people feel comfortable in them. They feel at home in them. They're scaled to the human form. Now, just think about it this way. You know, we're sitting in a pub right now. This pub is not scaled to a mouse. This is not a comfortable environment for a mouse. If a mouse came into this area, he might find a lot of food on the floor, but he'd scurry around and try to stay out of view and probably look for some place where he would feel at home, feel comfortable, a hole in the wall, just like when you think about, Ben and Jerry, or not Ben and Jerry. I'm thinking of ice cream. I'm thinking about Tom and Jerry. Tom and Jerry. So, with Tom, the cat, and then Jerry, the mouse, how the shtick goes, Tom tries to catch Jerry, and Jerry gets away and gets into his hole where he feels at home. Human beings feel at home in certain places and feel...
Like Ben and Jerry's.
Right.
That's one of the places we feel at home.
That's right. I do, too. I like Cherries Garcia and Chunky Monkey. Those are my favorite flavors. But this whole idea is something that seems very commonsensical, but has fallen out of favor in the modern era. In the modern world, architects are not so much interested in providing spaces in which people feel at home, comfortable, surrounded by beautiful things. They're interested in making statements, right? So you have schools of architecture that more or less have contempt or express contempt for not only the human form, but for human beings. So an example would be brutalism. This is a school of architecture. It celebrates ugliness. Usually, the buildings that are in the brutalist tradition are concrete structures that are out of scale, that are intended to make human beings feel uncomfortable and small and vulnerable. So, for example, in Boston, we have City Hall. So Boston is a city that is filled with beautiful architecture, but you can't say that for City Hall. City Hall is centered in the center of town, not too far from the old State House, and not even too far from the current State House on Beacon Hill. And it really looks like an inverted temple. It's kind of an Aztec temple with the top pointing down. So each successive floor gets broader as it goes up, and it's surrounded by a kind of concrete plaza that no one wants to be in. So if you ever get out of the subway there and go down the street, go down Tremont Street till you get to City Hall, you'll notice this vast sort of concrete wilderness where no one sits. Where do people go? I mean, there are a lot of people in downtown Boston. Where do they go? Well, they go down to Faneuil Hall, which is just about 2 blocks down, where you have buildings that were made in the 18th and 19th centuries that were designed for people.
At the University of Wisconsin, the humanities building there was built during the 70s probably, and the entire design was intended to make it difficult to get around.
Yeah. What is the deal with that?
In this particular case, it was a practical consideration. They wanted to make it takeover proof in student demonstrations.
Okay.
So you can't actually go into the building on the first floor. You have to go up and enter, sort of at the middle of the building, which is an old technique used in medieval castles.
Right.
For defense.
Right.
And then you can't get from one side of the building to the other directly. There are no hallways that run the entire length. You have to leave and come back in to get into the other half of it. It's remarkable.
Well, it belies its purpose. I mean, this is the humanities building, which is not designed for human access.
Right.
Yeah, well, anyway, but this is actually something that is a subject that has a much broader sort of range of application. When we think about human scale, I think, when it comes to architecture, it's tremendously important. I think that there are a number of things that we can see in classical architecture that demonstrate that the human form was really at the center of their thinking when it came to the things that they made, sort of the ratios involved and so forth. But in the modern era, the sort of the understanding of the universe as being hostile and alien and altogether scaled inhumanly has captured the imagination of a lot of people. And we see the effects of that all over the place, in education, in government, and so forth. So this idea of human scale is something at the heart, historically, of almost I would say every humane art. It is when we talk about humane arts, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about human beings, right?
Yeah.
And now, with regard to that, it doesn't mean that human beings are the physically largest thing around. What it means is that that human beings have a significance in the order of things, and that the things that we make ought to reflect that significance, and so on and so forth. But anyway, I don't know if you guys have. It was a really amusing story about the humanities building, but I don't know if you guys have anything else you want to throw in at this point.
Yeah, I actually find myself thinking of European cities.
Yeah.
Paris is a city that is built on a human scale.
Mm-hmm.
I love Paris.
Yeah.
It's a city that's made for walking.
Yep.
You go a little bit down the rail line and you get off at Versailles.
Yeah.
Versailles is not built on a human scale.
Huh.
It is built simply. It is built on the scale of Louis XIV's ego.
Gotcha.
Which is the size of the great outdoors, which is the way the palace is.
Right.
Now, interestingly enough, I don't think London is built on a human scale.
Huh.
I would have expected London to be.
Yeah.
But it really isn't. It doesn't have the same walkability. It doesn't have the same... the Houses of Parliament are just vast. They're huge. It's just... And it just does not feel as user-friendly as Paris does.
And they're very closed off. I mean, that's the other thing,
Yeah.
is you can stand at the gate and look at the soldiers in front of the palace. I mean, there is this detachment there as well. But interestingly, I mean, you have, for example, with cathedrals and stuff, which are obviously trying to go beyond the human scale because you're dealing with something transcendent. But even there, it's something that includes the human scale.
Right.
And actually, it comes right into it. It's actually that's the place in which that
and it's intended where it is not to human scale. It's intended to elevate the human.
Yes.
It's not intended to make the human small. It's intended to lift them up.
Whereas what Chris is talking about, where you flip that, where the human scale is almost made transcendent, the human itself is lost.
Yeah. Now, what I think is going on is a inhuman kind of shift in our metaphysic.
Yeah.
So in the modern world, think of nature as hostile, sort of completely hostile, alien, and something that is out there for us to conquer, whatever. Now, there's been some rethinking with regard to that, principally because of the ecologists and all the stuff that's going on with that. But even those folks have a kind of contempt for the human. The medieval view would look at the world quite differently. The medieval and the classical views saw human beings as part of the, order of things, the nature of things, but served a kind of important, purpose within that order, and consequently, it wasn't utterly alien. There might be things that are sublime and outsized and not intended for human habitation, but at the same time, there is in the order of things places for human beings. When you think about the cosmos in the old view, when we think about the vastness of that cosmos, there was a place for man, in the order of things, and in that place he had some significance, some dignity. But in the modern view, everything is utterly alien, and it's an exercise of human will and power to make oneself significant. So it's not so much a revelation of human significance as it is the assertion in the face of absurdity that we are significant, and then, of course, we die. And this is why people like Camus think, well, maybe we should just get it over with early and just kill ourselves. But anyway, so that's kind of in the background in terms of where I want to take this. Where do I want to take this? I want to take us into the field of or into the realm of politics and human community. So we started off with architecture, things that we make to inhabit, to interact with each other in, to shelter us. That includes everything from a House of Parliament to a house, and everything in between. But when we think about political institutions, can those get too big? If we could be, well, you've probably seen these things. Like when you drive down the road, there's this enormous rocking chair in front of some place, and you think, well, isn't that interesting? I would never put that in my house, but it certainly catches my attention. Yeah. And the only creature who could actually use that is someone the size of Goliath. When we think about human institutions, can a country get too big? Can a city get too big? Now, you can also look at it the other way. Can a city be too small? Can a country be too small? But I don't think we live in a world right now where that's a big problem. We're not trying to grow out of the sort of miniature world into a sort of healthy, full-sized world. We actually live in a world where our institutions dwarf us, make us feel insignificant and small, and reinforce that by, not being responsive to us. Yeah. And we just kind of rail against the machine, so to speak, rage against the machine, because the machine just doesn't ever recognize our place in the order of things. It just does its own thing. Yeah. What do you think about that?
When you go back to the ancient Greek polis, the Greeks believed that cities should not go above, I believe the number was somewhere around 10,000 people, because, even with the Greek amphitheaters, which are marvels of acoustics, that's the maximum number of people that could be addressed by a speaker without amplification.
Right.
And you don't want a city that is so big that you can't talk to all of them at once.
Right. Well, this brings up a passage in a book that I'm currently working my way through entitled The Breakdown of Nations by Leopold Kohr. Now, Leopold Kohr is one of these funky theorists that people in a particular discipline are all aware of, but he's out of fashion. And there can be different reasons why you're out of fashion. Sometimes you can be out of fashion because you're uncomfortably correct. Alexander Solzhenitsyn found himself in that spot. He was out of favor because he made people who were powerful uncomfortable. And how did he do that? By telling the truth. But anyway, this idea, as you know, Glenn, is an ancient one, and it was expressed really marvelously by Aristotle in Politics. And so this particular passage that's quoted in Kohr's book, The Breakdown of Nations, is from Politics. It's from chapter 7, section 3. So let me read it. A state, then, only begins to exist when it has attained a population sufficient for a good life in the political community. So you need to get to a certain size, Aristotle says. It's possible to be too small. Let me get back to him. He goes on to say, it may indeed, if it somewhat exceed this number, be a greater state. But, as I was saying, there must be a limit. What should be the limit will be easily ascertained by experience. For both governors and governed have duties to perform. The special functions of a governor are to command and judge. But if the citizens of a state are to judge and to distribute offices according to merit, then they must know each other's character. Where they do not possess this knowledge, both the election to offices and the decisions of lawsuits will go wrong. Now, we would never experience anything like that, right? You know, we've never seen that ever happen. Obviously, I'm speaking tongue-in-cheek. Let me go back to Aristotle here. When the population is very large, they are manifestly settled at haphazard, which clearly ought not to be. Besides, in an overpopulous state, foreigners and medics will readily acquire the rights of citizens. Now, we've never heard that happen here in the United States. You know. For who will find them out? Clearly, then, the best limit of the population of a state is the largest number which suffices for the purpose of life and can be taken in at a single view. That line, taken in at a single view, I think is important. So what Aristotle's saying is, okay, you need to get to a certain size. You need to find critical mass. You need to acquire critical mass to be a city that can, or a community that can do the things that you want your community to do and do them well. But for the citizens of such a community to be really capable of understanding their community, of being engaged in their in their common life, of actually being able to elect people that they know and actually recognize in the course of life, not just because they've seen them on a poster or watched them on television, so that they can have an understanding of the character of those people. Because, we all know, for example, Ellen's on television right now here in the pub. Okay, Ellen is a smiling lesbian who presents herself as, a very enlightened and friendly person. But what have we learned about Ellen in the last couple of years? She is one of the nastiest people in entertainment. People despise her who've worked for her. Now, the only reason we know that is because there is a, sort of a press that celebrates the salacious and wants to sort of do that kind of thing to people. But if we actually knew Ellen for ourselves, we would know that already, right? But how could you possibly know her in a world like ours, where things are so out of scale, and there is absolutely no possibility of actually ever meeting her unless you're in the studio audience or actually get to work for her on her show, which, from the sound of it, isn't a very pleasant experience. How would you do that? Well, you got to be in a community that makes it feasible, makes it possible. What do you think about that?
We have to remember Aristotle is working in the context of city-states. The thing about Greece is the geography really dictated a lot of what went on there. Greece is basically mountains and sea.
Right.
So you have city-states that develop, and a city-state, by definition, is a city that controls the surrounding rural countryside. Okay. They're isolated. You can't get over the mountains. It's very difficult to unite Greece. So Aristotle's thinking of a context in which the culture is really dominated by small polities. It would be interesting to see what he would have to say if he were in an area with plains or something like that.
Well, he does reflect on that.
Where you could actually develop a larger level of polity.
Well, he does reflect on that when he contrasts the Persian,
okay,
the sort of your typical Persian with your typical Greek. One of the things he does in the Politics and elsewhere is he outlines he puts up for consideration 3 different kinds of people: the barbarian, the Greek, polis dweller, and the Persian. And with the Persian, what you have is a servile person who defers to authority because he's afraid of getting his head chopped off all the time.
Again, the question would be, if he lived in an environment in which larger polities were possible, is that the only alternative?
Well, yeah, let me continue. So then he presents you with the barbarian. Mm-hmm. So the barbarian is at the opposite extreme. Thumos, spiritedness, controls sort of the behavior of the barbarian and makes it difficult for barbarians to create the kind of cultural institutions that Aristotle celebrates. And in the middle, you have what you have with the Greek city-state dweller, a person who possesses thumos, spiritedness, but at the same time has a kind of community spirit. He's a person who knows that there are certain things that we can do together that we can't accomplish on our own. And so you've got the best of both. Now, physical environments, I think, are important. So one of the things that Kohr talks about in the Breakdown of Nations is that when we look at a place like Switzerland, which is just very much in the spirit of what you've just talked about, you've got a kind of thing that happens there that you don't see in other places. So physical environment is important. It makes it easier to do what Kohr and Aristotle are describing. But here's the thing. Where would you really rather live? Would you really rather live in Persia or with the barbarians in Germania or in a Greek city-state? Because according to Kohr, according to Aristotle, according also to Nassim Taleb, remember Taleb who wrote The Black Swan, where you see creativity flourish is not in the empire, and it's not in the hinterlands of Germania. Where you see creativity flourish is in Venice. It's in Athens. It's in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. It's in these places that are smaller in scale. That's where we see the Mozarts.
Well, and I think that's what you see. I mean, what you tend to happen in, let's say, New York City, for example, something that you think, expands into this grand scale. People get lost in it, but you start to have the village, right? You start to have the east side, upper east side, or lower east side, depending on, and they start to become communities that have to break from that larger, being absorbed into the larger in order to create that scale for something creative and human to carve itself out. I think you see that regularly when the scale gets
too large. Things get broken up into smaller bits.
Smaller.
Now, the problem with a place like New York is the things that people tend to collect around tend to be pretty weird. Yeah. So if you think about the village, we're talking about a lot of homosexuals and a lot of basically, when you get into Manhattan, the story is different when you're in Queens or, the Bronx or Staten Island. There you've got people who've grown up in New York and actually will probably die in New York, and their parents did too. But you get to Manhattan, people from Iowa live in Manhattan. It's a place where kids who were maybe made fun of in high school because they were in drama club moved to. You know what I'm saying? It's not really made up of New Yorkers. It's made up of a bunch of discontents from other parts of the country. Much of the time, I know that's putting things in a pretty stark way. But I know New York. I know people from New York. I know how it actually kind of works. And
it's interesting that you should say that, because my dad's from Brooklyn. My mom's from Queens.
Yeah.
I can tell you about the Bronx.
Yeah.
There's a distinct accent in each of these areas.
Right.
And, when you're watching Captain America, he's from Brooklyn and Spider-Man is from the Bronx.
Okay.
Excuse me, Queens.
Queens, right. Queens, right.
But aside from maybe Harlem, there's nothing distinctive about Manhattan that is specific to Manhattan. All of these other ones, there is a culture there.
Right.
But Manhattan doesn't seem to have the same. I never really considered that.
Yeah.
But except for a few neighborhoods, perhaps, Manhattan doesn't really have that same kind of sense.
My feel for Manhattan is that it's a place for a lot of discontented people and for people who want to make a lot of money and people who are into certain kinds of performing art. And, I enjoy my time in Manhattan. If you listened to me and didn't know me, you might think I was just like someone who hated New York. I walk around with a T-shirt with, instead of the heart.
I skull and crossbones, New York.
I actually, when I get down to New York, I enjoy myself. Now, I wouldn't right now because the place is like shut down like a warehouse at 3 a.m. But when it's
actually the warehouse is in New York at 3 a.m, not necessarily shut down.
Yeah, I'm thinking about warehouses out here. So. But anyway, getting back to kind of the heart of what I'm getting to, there's something about scale and our human nature. That's almost like saying something obscene to many modern people, to say human nature.
Yeah.
They don't want to think of humans as having a nature because then we're talking about something that's fixed. And they want to self-create.
That's right. And I think that was my point with even when we try, these cities grow to these, this huge scale, our human nature pulls us into these subgroups, these smaller communities to somehow capture what we're talking about here.
Right.
So going back to the example Manhattan, I've thought of a couple of other places. We mentioned the Village, I mentioned Harlem. And even there, you've got to break that down into different parts. But you've got Chinatown, you've got Little Italy, you've got things like that are all these specific kinds of enclaves of where people who have some sort of common bond gather together.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that makes those places so charming is the boundary that defines them, or the boundaries that define them. But the thing that our current...
But when you think about Manhattan, you don't think of Little Italy. You don't think of Chinatown. You think of downtown.
Right. Yeah, and I think that, when you get there and you walk around and you get a sense of the place, like, you get what you're talking about. But even those places are under siege. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if we were to go to Boston, we could go to the North End, which was Boston's Little Italy. The place is completely overrun with a bunch of, millennials and, those folks who have basically priced out of the neighborhood all the old Italian families that were there for generations. Mm-hmm. Like when you get, I think it was like Prego or Ragu spaghetti sauce. I remember seeing that there's this great page on Facebook called Dirty Old Boston. And in that, there's this television advertisement for spaghetti sauce, and there's this Italian mother in a flat, looks like a cold water flat in the North End of Boston, and she just opens up the window and calls out, "Anthony!" And Anthony's like 3 blocks away playing stickball with his buddies in the street, and he runs home, and there's just this apartment is just packed with his brothers and his sisters and his aunts and his uncles. You know what? That does not exist in Boston today.
Yeah.
That is nostalgia. That is what used to be the case. You know what you got there now? You got some girl with pink hair who's a lesbian with her cats in the apartment that Anthony's family used to live in. And she's a senior vice president at Prudential or something like that. That's what Boston is like today. And so is Manhattan. And what you've got to have, if you're going to have genuine community, is a sense of the inside and the outside. Okay, you're in, you're not in. if you were back in the day, I was in the North End in the 80s and stuff, like if you weren't Italian, they would just look at it and say, obviously you're just here for the restaurants.
Yeah.
You don't actually live here.
It's like Greek town in Chicago.
Sure. But even those places are all under threat.
Yeah.
Because what we have today is it's all about movement and efficiency and choice, and the boundaries that help to make a community what it is are all seen to be retrograde, oppressive, what have you.
Well, and I think it's... Go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, and I think that the culture has, by and large, lost any sense of history or tradition that is no longer considered part of identity. Mm-hmm. I'm tempted to say they're sort of like the guys on some of the Reformed Facebook pages I see who want to get rid of all tradition, unless it came from the Puritans.
That's right.
Yeah, and they don't realize that they're romanticists in a perverse form, and they're not acting out of their Christian faith at all. I mean, one of the things you see, the trend in history is after you develop this notion in Western thought, a move away from Christianity, the notion that the human being is basically the origin of everything that it is, even including its values, its meaning, its own nature, how we determine what to do with the world out there. You start to see through the Romantic movement this notion that nature is organic, right? And but all the institutions that grow up in it basically try to become prison houses that stifle us from our true freedom. And so convention, cities wrapped around true culture and long-standing institutions, marriage, family, larger family. I think this is one of the things you see gets broken down. Is sort of the core is the family, of course, and then as it builds out of that, as all of that breaks down, everything needs to be basically we need to be liberated from. So we need to be liberated from everything, even the statues in front of the art museum that were meant to symbolize some kind of freedom and liberation. And so, when you have this kind of human being seen as basically nothing but a series of choices that determine their own life, fate, meaning, value, everything else. And anything that puts a limit on that has to go. And you put that into a group of people as large as Boston, then you have eradicated any possibility of legitimate community.
Right. Well, I want to bring this back to this idea of the optimal size of a community, and in part, we have to get into the matter of what kind of community are we talking about. So let's think about churches, since a lot of our listeners will be able to relate to this. Now, we're probably familiar with the Dunbar number, right? The British anthropologist Dunbar, who said that kind of people are more or less wired to live in a community that's no larger than, say, 250 people. In the sense that basically you can only, it's between about 100 and 250. That's kind of the range at which people can kind of take in a community at a glance. After that, then you're like, I think I saw that person once or twice at church maybe 6 months ago, if you're talking about a megachurch.
Yeah.
One of the things about megachurches that have always made me uneasy is how artificial they are. What you do is you essentially what megachurches have gotten over is something they call the 200 barrier. Yeah. So this is like a terrible thing, the 200 barrier. It's this sort of this obstacle to becoming this enormous whatever. Yeah. And in order to get over that, you have to restructure things so that things tend to be kind of organized, designed to reflect a kind of corporate mindset. And you go into a whole different kind of mode of relating to people. You go from being, saints who are gathered to worship to customers or an audience to entertain.
Well, I think that one right there is worth pausing on, because I think that's what you usually hear is our kids love the vast amount of programs. What are those programs? They're not community building.
No.
Very large, very small levels of discipleship and the rest. But it's tends to be entertainment that keeps them engaged.
Right.
But it teaches them.
Right.
To
kind of like Sesame Street. When you think about Sesame Street, I'm all set. When you think about Sesame Street, the big criticism about Sesame Street is no one ever learns anything on Sesame Street, except maybe the count, being able to imitate the count, who teaches you to count to 3 or whatever. 1, 2, 3, ha, 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 ha. So I know how to imitate the count, but I didn't actually learn to count by listening to the count. Same thing with Cookie Monster or Oscar the Grouch or whatever. So you have what's actually a diversion disguised as education. How much education is really going on in Sesame Street? Well, that's what you have in a lot of children's programs in churches.
Yeah.
What's really going on here? Are we just trying to make the kids happy for a period of time so mom and dad can go upstairs and get their TED Talk experience from Pastor Superstar? I mean, that's really what you have in those places.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big thing, and I see it over and over again. And it teaches children that basically spirituality is to be equated with entertainment.
Right.
And the minute that entertainment isn't suffice, all of a sudden, it's if you find entertainment that engages you anywhere else, it's on the same spiritual level. And
right.
What you tend to see, I remember my oldest once saying, he said, the church is trying so hard to make its music sound like the music that, all my friends listen to,
right.
But it can't compete with it.
No, there's no way you can.
And it's just like a hollow, cheap version of what we would see is the better stuff for our age and generation. And so it doesn't say anything to them. And so in the attempt to pull them in to kind of give them a deeper spiritual message, they actually see it as the thin-veiled, superficial vehicle that it really is.
And then sometimes our best kids go somewhere else to be challenged.
Yeah.
But this is all kind of, I think, part and parcel of this. What are we trying to be when we establish a community? Glenn, you have something you want to say?
I was just going to make the observation. Have you ever noticed that what contemporary means in terms of Christian music is stuff that's about 30 years out of date?
Right, that's right. It's what
if you really wanted to do contemporary, it would be rap.
Right. Yeah,
it would be hip hop. It would be something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, nobody's going to do that.
Well, and we should do is we should return to the permanent things, to foundational matters, and say, what are we up to anyway? And is there a Christian way to think about institutions? Is there a Christian way to think about optimal size when it comes to institutions? Or is bigger better for everything? So let's think about it this way. Cancer. What is cancer? Cancer is a disease that is growth out of proportion. That's what it is. Certain cells in your body are growing too large, and they're not a part of a larger, healthy physiology, and so they end up killing you because they can't stop growing. So if we were to say, okay, a one-cell organism at a microscopic level is great. Therefore, a one-cell organism at the size of a football field is that much better. That's really the way we think about communities when it comes to size. We don't think about them in terms of what are we trying to celebrate when we think about the community, or what are we trying to accomplish, or what is this community supposed to be? It's just, it's bigger. That's the only thing that we have to measure value is size. If it's bigger, it's better. So New York, because it's bigger, is more powerful. It's more influential. Now, I'm going to get on a hobby horse of mine. And as I think as I think about New York, there are a lot of Reformed people who think that Tim Keller is changing the world because he has a big church in New York. I've been to that church about half a dozen times. Let me tell you something. In terms of its relationship to the larger sort of scene there in New York, it's nothing. I was in a service at Keller's Church, which contained maybe 2,000 people. As soon as we walked out the door, the entire community just disappeared into the crowd. It was like, what happened? It was like magic. There were 2,000 people here, and now they're lost in 50,000 people. And you'd say, wow, isn't it great that we've got this big presence in New York? We're making a difference. Well, you've made some difference in some people's lives. And by the way, I wouldn't even take that at face value. A lot of the people in Keller's Church went to churches in Tubunk, Iowa, or wherever you're from, and are kind of like lonely as they're pursuing their dreams on Broadway and want to get a little bit of home in New York.
Well,
let me just finish this one thought, though, Tom. But what we have actually that's happened in the Reform world is that Keller, and I don't think that he did this intentionally, but Keller used New York to change the Reformed world. The Reformed world didn't use Keller to change New York. Keller used New York and the size and the brand of New York and the envy of many pastors who wanted to be him to change the Reformed world. So size can really skew things in really bad ways.
I thought you were going to say something in the middle of all that, so I was going to sort of leave it to you, but...
My attention deficit took over. And I lost my train of thought. So.
Yeah. One of the things that I find interesting when you compare what we do when we are thinking about building churches and when you go to the Global South, when you go to Sierra Leone, for example, is they are not at all concerned about the size of the church. What they're concerned about is what is the church doing. So a small church, they have three different size churches: rabbit churches, lion churches, and elephant churches. And the trick is that elephant churches are like elephants. They reproduce very slowly. Rabbit churches are like rabbits. They reproduce very fast. They're small, they're agile.
Right.
And the trick is they want to maintain, as the church grows, they want to maintain what they call rabbit DNA. So there are elephant churches in Sierra Leone that have rabbit DNA. They are fast reproducing. They typically reproduce by founding other churches rather than bringing more people in.
Right.
But, their metric that they use for determining how the churches are doing has got nothing to do with what we think of in terms of attendance or size. It has to do with how many new churches are planted, how many new discovery groups are there, how much disciple making is going on. That's what they're looking at, that's what they're measuring, not how many people are showing up on an average Sunday.
Right. Well, I'd like to think a little more about this whole matter from a kind of a metaphysical perspective. So when I think about, when I talk about metaphysics, you guys know what I'm talking about, but sometimes people who hear that word more or less kind of go into mysticism mode. They think metaphysics.
They just say you're a Thomist, and they shut the podcast off.
I wish they would be. I wish they knew enough to even say that. I think
actually most of them probably go to you're a New Ager.
Yeah. That's right.
So what I'm getting at is that when I think about metaphysics, I'm thinking about what's ultimately real.
Yeah.
So even people who say I don't believe in metaphysics have a metaphysic.
Yeah.
Their metaphysic is zero.
Yeah.
Their metaphysic is that we live in a structureless, meaningless thing, and that the only thing that provides structure is the human will. So it's through our organization, our organizations, our capacity to sort of get people to do what we want, all these different things are what make the difference. The universe or the reality is like Play-Doh or like silly putty, and it bears our image that we stamp on it. But if that's not the case, if there is a kind of sort of inner structure to reality. What is it, and what ought we to have in mind when we think about it? Now, here's the paradox. Medieval people would talk about, and the ancients would talk about, man as a microcosm.
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which we, human beings, men and women, are in some way a miniature of the cosmos. So there's a macrocosm and there's a microcosm. Now, what are we to make of that? Well, one of the things I think we can make of that is that, in some sense, human beings really are central to the cosmos. Now, we've been talking a little bit about, our tendency as modern human beings to sort of impress upon sort of this dull and formless stuff that surrounds us, our will. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is something, I think, more significant. Now, we think about, as Christians, the idea, the truth that we are the image of God. So we're the image of God. So in some sense, we resemble God. Now, sin, as we think about this from a Christian, in a Christian framework, sin is in some sense marred the image, or made it comical or monstrous. Nevertheless, there's still a kind of resemblance. You can say, okay, even though you're not living up to what you're called to be, there is something there that is, something that reflects God. Now, man as the microcosm kind of takes that and flips it. And so what we're looking at with man, the microcosm, is somehow as the universe itself reflects and expresses the attributes and powers of God. In some sense, because we are made in God's image, we as well are kind of a reflection of the attributes and powers of the cosmos. So think about it this way. One crude way to think about it is to say, okay, when we think about the four elements, from the old perspective, air, water, fire, and earth, human beings, when we're living, possess all those things. I'm warm, fire. Liquid, saliva, blood, water.
Beer.
Yes, beer. That's right.
Sorry.
That's how we replenish the water supply. Right. But then the earth, of course, is our physicality, and then air. If we stop breathing, we're dead. So all of those things are present in us. So this larger reality, all of the elements find their place in us. But that could be said of a beaver. That could be said of lots of other creatures. What makes us so different? Logos, reason, the image of God. There's something more that we possess that no other creature possesses that makes us the microcosm. There's a sense in which when reason orders our lives in the same way that that reason orders the cosmos, we are in the microcosm.
Well, and this is the exact thing that gets flipped with the modern world and postmodern world, is that the universe is a microcosm of us.
Yeah, right.
And this is what I think you're talking about, the scale. When the scale gets flipped and the theology gets flipped, then it becomes dehumanizing.
Right.
At the end, I mean, Nietzsche has this brilliant point when after he talks about the death of God and thus spoke Zarathustra. You have this sense, God is dead and we've killed him. It keeps on going. The old gods will revive. We don't really see at the end. At the end of it, he eventually says, man will die too.
Yes.
The human being will die. And so what ends up happening here is that very thing. Is so we become the macro, and everything else becomes the micro. That's what is really the modern world leading into the postmodern, is the flip. Once you make those shifts, we've talked about them all the time, and even if we all agree on the same way it comes about, something shifts in which God and all things related to God flips to the human being and all things related to the human. And when that ends up taking on the scope it does, it's what you're talking about. Things are not really what happens is the human almost is, Michael Gillespie says, takes on the divine attributes in a perverse way. So the human becomes all powerful, all meaningful, all determinative of all reality and all centrality. And so things are not, the human starts to do things not on the human scale as a microcosm, but as the measure of all things. Right. And so when Prometheus basically makes its pronouncement, it's doing so as if it's almost the classical view of God.
Right.
But
creating something out of nothing.
And so what you have in your mega churches is a bunch of demiurges, if you will, that are each their own god.
You better define demiurge.
Demiurge is the one who gives all meaning, shape, and form to the whole of creation. Little god, basically. No, I was about to say something. No, I don't want to go there. I was going to say the god of William Craig, but I don't know. Plato's intelligent designer.
Caleb, can you cut that?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. We believe that. Well, that's a whole subject for another show. But I know exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
Now, another thing that needs to be said here is that the medieval and Renaissance concept of man as a microcosm implied that there was a givenness about the universe.
That's right, and that there are limits.
And the key thing here is that, okay, well, how is man a microcosm? You talked about the four elements, but let's go beyond that. God and the angels are rational. Mm-hmm. They are spiritual. Mm-hmm. They are moral. Mm-hmm. They are eternal. Mm-hmm. Beavers, which you mentioned before, are physical. Mm-hmm. They're sensual. Mm-hmm. They have senses.
Right.
They are mortal.
Right.
They are temporal.
Right.
Humanity is all of the above.
Yeah, we're this remarkably amphibious creature.
Right. To quote
Lewis. Yeah. As Stanley Yaki, I don't know if you remember him from years ago, was a Benedictine astrophysicist and theologian, but he wrote a little book.
Oh, yeah, I remember him.
Remember the book he wrote? Something about in between angels and apes. But right in between angel and neither angel nor ape. And he was critiquing both Descartes and Darwin at that point.
I remember his book, The Science of Origins and the Origins of Science.
Yeah, but it was that same exact point Glenn is making. But one of the things to keep in mind, and I think this is crucial, what shifts from classic Christian vision of things is the notion that this is to be understood in a way that is by analogy. The human is a microcosm, of course, closer to the whole structure of the universe as it's ordered to God. But the whole of creation is analogous to the Creator. It's not the same as the Creator. One way of putting it is this way. All creation is like God, but God is not like anything in creation. And I think that is the way the classic Christian vision understood this. This is why the visible can be open to and manifest the invisible attributes of God. Because the creation is enough, it has the glory of God communicated to it. It's declared good. But it is not goodness itself. It participates in that goodness as a creaturely gift. And so by doing that, it has the perfections of God to be able to manifest in its goodness, the infinite goodness, but not fully encapsulate it, control it, contain it.
What I'd like to do at this point, Tom, is I'd like to sort of bring this, because we're getting close to the end here, I'd like to bring this to something I think is really important to keep in mind at our time.
Yeah.
And what took me this direction initially was this whole matter of how size relates to servility and tyranny.
Yeah.
So tyrannies, and this is one of the things that Leopold Kohr gets into in his book, The Breakdown of Nations. Tyrannies that are small are almost kind of comic. Yeah. Do you remember Chitty Chitty Bang Bang?
Yep.
In Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, they get into the car and they go to this little German, kingdom where they've got the child catcher and they've got all these sort of ridiculous but maniacal people who dislike children and want to keep them out of sight, and they even want to get rid of them entirely. And so, but the thing about it is that this is a tiny place, and if you just travel 20 miles in any direction, you're out of it. The problem with modern states, because they're so large, so they're ubiquitous. You can't get away from these things. They surround you, and there is no escape. And what does that do to the human spirit? In order for a human being to have thumos, the way Aristotle tells us, a person needs to have thumos if he's going to be a citizen and someone worthy of our regard. He can't be so overmatched so as to make him servile. So let me read a couple of things here from Kohr's book, and I think these will provide us with plenty of material to reflect on as we conclude here. But this is talking about scale, of course, again, and he says, for large-scale tyranny becomes not only respectable and practically irremovable because of the impressive physical force it is able to muster in its defense, it becomes doubly so by breeding at a critical magnitude in the people the appropriate philosophy of submission. In previous applications of the power of size theory and social misery, we have found that a criminal mental climate is not a cause but consequence of the mass commission of crime, and the aggressive state of mind not cause but consequence of the acquisition of aggressive power. For the same reason, it is not submissive disposition that leads to the misery of tyranny, but tyrannical power growing in proportion to the size of the community that leads at a critical magnitude to the condoning spirit of submission. Submissiveness is thus not a human quality that could be explained to a significant extent as the result of upbringing, tradition, national character, or the mode of production. Like most other social attitudes, it is the adaptive reflex reaction with which man responds to power. Its degree varies directly with the degree of power, just as its opposite reaction, the assertion of freedom, varies inversely with it. Where there is power, there is submission, and where there is no submission, there is no power. This is why historically the seemingly most freedom-loving peoples have accepted tyranny as submissively as the seemingly most submissive ones, or why it is safe to say that even Americans would submit if our federal structure permitted the accumulation of the necessary volume of governmental power. For as young Boswell confided so touchingly in his London journal, quote, when the mind knows it cannot help itself by struggling, it quietly and patiently submits to whatever load is laid upon it. This was written in the 1950s, by the way. But I think this reflects our situation today.
Yeah.
Shut up and put on a mask. Shut up. Just close the business down. It doesn't need to make sense. It doesn't need to make sense to you. Who are you that your reason should stand in the way of the will of the state?
You know, this has come up before, but currently there are, well, as of 2019, the federal regulations were 72,000 pages long.
All right.
In 2011, I think it was, a book came out called 3 Felonies a Day,
Right.
which said that the average person in America commits 3 felonies a day without knowing it. Now, the total number of pages of federal regulations is down by 25,000.
Right.
It was 97,000 when Obama left office. I think I've quoted those numbers before, but the point is that that level of intrusive regulation has already happened, and he's exactly right. People are just sort of rolling over and playing dead.
Yeah, and you can't have it otherwise. For something to be very large, there has to be standardization. There has to be a lot of bureaucratization. There has to be a lot of conformity for very large monolithic things to do what they do.
Right. And the genius of the Constitution as originally set up, key phrase, as originally set up, is that it allowed for autonomy at the level of the states, but uniformity at the level of the country in those matters where it was necessary. Mm-hmm. The 10th Amendment is the most routinely ignored amendment in the entire Constitution. The 10th Amendment says that any powers that are not specifically granted to the federal government belong to either the state or the individual.
Right.
And that's been completely ignored.
Right.
And the net result is standardization, one-size-fits-none policies, things like that.
For me, early on in my life, I realized I didn't want to be a part of something bureaucratic in nature at all. I didn't want anything to do with it. I guess partly it had to do with my sort of where I found myself in kind of the nature or sort of the course of my life. I was a ward of the state. I was subject to the poking and the prodding and the questioning of people with clipboards and white, coats who were there, for my best, in my best interest. Like the song Mrs. Robinson, the idea that, these people just really want to help you, Mrs. Robinson, But I had such kind of a visceral, gut level kind of distaste for that poking and prodding and stuff like that. I didn't want anything to do with it.
What you need to do is leave Mrs. Robinson and go to Dear Kindly Sergeant Krupke or whatever it was called from West Side Story. That's your life.
Well, that's pretty much. And by the way, I would much rather deal with a cop than a psychologist anytime, because at least with a cop, it's just honest. Do what you're told. Don't do what you're not supposed to do, and I'll leave you alone.
Yeah.
That's not what a psychologist wants to do.
Seriously. Look up the song Sergeant Krupke.
I know the song. I'm familiar with West Side Story. I like it. Yeah. But the idea is that there's this sort of meddlesome goodness, this sort of intrusiveness into your life when people want to fix you. But beyond that, I found myself as just a kind of, object on a kind of conveyor belt of human services in these large and personal institutions. And whether we're talking about schools or mental hospitals or social service agencies, they all were, had the same kind of very dour, depressing floor tiles, ceiling tiles, sort of fluorescent lights.
And they've even gotten worse. I mean, they're really just a continuous belt on which you kind of ride it out. You go out for a little while, and then you ride it right back in.
Right.
And it's one big...
And then I went to work for State Street Bank, which was an investment bank in the Boston area. And I worked there during my college years, working my way through school. And I said, that's it. I will never work for another corporation the rest of my life. And I haven't. I've kept that promise. And, but what kind of sort of is at work is this visceral kind of repugnance. It's the reason why I didn't get involved with, sort of mega churches, why I've always found mega churches repellent. What I'm looking for, and this is very, I'm talking about me here. What I'm looking for is human things, where people matter, with their quirks and their idiosyncrasies and their histories, and you don't have any of that stuff when everything is standardized, bureaucratized, controlled.
Well, and I think this has been a strange attraction of a lot of Christians with a similar concern. I think attractiveness to a lot of what the Romantics were up to as well is that a very connectedness to creation, nature, agriculture, your hands in the dirt, and real, genuine community that didn't become the Tower of Babel,
right.
But really fostered. And I think this is what, the Christian community is supposed to be. Very connected to the created and moral order, redeemed in Christ. And I think there's something central to that that would that keeps us connected to the enchanted rather than disenchantment that comes with modernity, post-modernity, but also the swelling.
Yeah, like right now we're watching Governor Ned Lamont here in Connecticut talk about the state of the COVID, response, and Connecticut's got 4 million people or so, and there's absolutely zero nuance. There's zero sort of attention to the particulars of a business, of a church, of a neighborhood, of any kind of community. Everything is one size fits all.
Yeah.
This is what you're supposed to do.
And a lot of what's going on is submission to New York, from what I hear.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So we live in the shadow of New York, and if it wasn't New York, it'd be Boston.
Now, something that you were talking about just there it resonated with some things I've been thinking about lately. The command that was given to Adam in Genesis 2:15, I think it is, was to tend and protect the garden. Mm-hmm. Or tend and keep, it's sometimes translated, but the word implies protect.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And what that says is two things. First of all, when you take a look at the garden, it's not just the trees and things like that. I mean, it's described in terms of all of the resources that are present there. Mm-hmm. So tending the garden means developing its resources.
Yeah.
Protecting the garden means doing it in a way that's not exploitive.
Yeah.
So, in other words, we do have to pay attention to, we have to develop, but we also have to pay attention to ecology. We have to be engaged with this sort of natural, this concern about the natural world.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
But that doesn't mean we don't develop. We have to develop too.
Yeah.
There's an interesting dynamic there in terms of the balance, which I think ties into this idea of human size, because you can't get New York without leveling a good part of the creation.
Yeah.
It is very much, I mean, there's other shows we've done, but it's very much, I mean, New York is an exhibition of, the heresy of modern conceptions of what it means to be a human being. I mean, this kind of bringing the whole into submission through my instrumental reason to serve my purposes and my will. And I mean, that's really what it is. And so it's this technology writ large. It's entertainment writ large. It's consumerism writ large. I mean, it's all of those things projected up to the grandest scale, which we think is exhibiting what our ideals, to pull on Feuerbach, projected onto a city. And I think Feuerbach's exactly right there. We have divinized ourselves, and New York is kind of the emblem of that divinization.
Yeah. Anyway, that's a good note to end on.
I don't want to slam New Yorkers, but
well, I think that there is a kind of Babylon-esque character to Manhattan.
Yeah.
Anyway, with those things in mind, and that cheerful thought, we really ought to wrap it up here, because we've gone a little longer than we even go most times. So thanks a lot for listening to the Theology Pugcast, and we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye now.